Thank you, Chair, for giving me this opportunity to speak to a distinguished audience like I have here this morning. As far as the maritime connectivity is concerned, I think we first must realize that already some connectivity exists, and also the ocean resources are being exploited by India, by ASEAN countries, and also through their collaboration. The issue here, as I see, really is that how we are going to transition to blue economy to make more sustainable use of the ocean resources and thereby give a different direction to the trajectory of our cooperation and our economic growth. Now, as I see it, blue economy and maritime connectivity, I think, in my view, there are two sides. There are two sides to it. One, of course, is blue economy, which is sustainable use of ocean resources, and the other side is climate change, because unless the obverse side of use of ocean resources, unless that is addressed adequately, we'll find that our capacity to use the ocean resources in a sustainable manner would not only be limited, but also diminish progressively, increasingly. And here, of course, the infrastructure plays a very critical role in achieving both these objectives. Now, as far as the oceans are concerned, there has been the warning by the UN report on the state of the oceans, where already it has been stated in that report that the capacity of the exploitation of ocean resources has in many cases been crossed. So that is really a warning sign for us. It's also, therefore, there is an urgency in our efforts both for addressing or developing our capacity or ability for blue economy, but also, as I said, to address the other issues. Now, there are, of course, there's a huge demand placed on our institutional resources, on our technological capabilities, and our it's a much wider spectrum of effort from that point of view. We know that there is the endangered coral reefs, not only in South China Sea or the Western Pacific, but also in the Indian Ocean, the mangrove, and the threat to the seagrass. Similarly, when there is this kind of a fragile ocean ecology, it's actually translating to higher business risks, whether in terms of higher volatility in resource prices, higher taxation, environmental performance, and market requirements of sustainability reports of various companies. So the template for blue economy, in my view, is, I think, goes much beyond shipping and port management. There are larger communities depending on this sort of resource. These are coastal and small island nations. They depend on fishing, minerals, and of course, the other resources that we can harness are, of course, tremendous, whether it's hydrocarbon, rare earths, polymetallic nodules, marine biodiversity, etc. The climate change side of this, of course, is the increasing importance in terms of monsoon forecasting, weather modeling, scientific interest in climate change phenomenon, and the vulnerabilities arising from increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and the littoral's coping capabilities. They have implications, as we've seen, because the fact certainly it's true about the Indian Ocean, but also it's true about South China Sea and the Western Pacific, that they have these coping capabilities are critical when we talk in terms of maritime connectivity, and they have, because of the fact that there are implications for administrative collapse, spread of radicalism, societal breakdown, and even critically regional stability. And therefore it brings into some kind of focus governance deficit and capability inadequacies which can aggravate these challenges. Now here, the oceanographic capabilities are extremely important because of the fact that they help us in devising geohazard coping capabilities in terms of vulnerability mapping of littoral areas and vital onshore and offshore infrastructure. Better meteorological capabilities contribute to blue economy for better tapping of coastal marine ecology, involving island development activities, drugs from the sea, integrated coastal marine area management, coastal monitoring, protection systems, implications for sea level rise, natural sinking of islands, sustaining island communities, integrated coastal communities, and geoengineering responses. Formerly, this scientist was a member of NASA, Stephen Harrison, who actually talked about India's special risk to climate change, which actually he said is unpredictable, and the inflection points are very difficult to actually divine as to how the inflection points might develop and what implication it might have. But it also has implications for coastal urban demography and the fact that our littoral areas have huge megacities which themselves have their own infrastructure issues. Therefore, all of these are actually extremely critical issues for us. And as we'll realize that as we think in terms of blue economy and how we want to tap it in terms through our bilateral cooperation, we also have to take into account the fact that the range of activities required in this is immense. I mean, we cannot build possibly some high-tech special economic zones and forget about the surrounding hinterland where the populations are living in extreme poverty and they're living in a very low-tech kind of environment. I'm talking in terms of fishing communities, those rather rural communities which actually depend on the resources of the resources of the ocean and sea-related activity. Now, and of course, the other aspect of this really would be in terms of how we further pursue in our policies the SDG, this goal 14, which actually talks about food security, protein demand, coastal maritime tourism, seaborne trade and infrastructure, non-renewable, renewable energy, ecological and sustainable coastal urbanization, and ocean technologies. I would actually even mention that as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, but that is not just confined to Indian Ocean, the fact that the marine ecosystem has been quite badly damaged because of ocean warming, and whether it's phytoplankton or tuna catch rates, which actually, or other endangered fishing species, actually are actually creating a crisis of their own, affecting huge communities which are actually depending on this kind of activity. I mean, there is of course a very famous thing about the Indian Ocean carbon patch, which covers at least about 5 million square kilometers, and it travels around the Indian Ocean about once in 5 years. This is something which is larger than the India's landmass and an extended exclusive economic zone. So you can imagine in terms of the tasks that we have, they are immense tasks, and I would actually say that we are just about beginning to pay attention to it. And if we can say that Indo-Pacific or India and ASEAN in some way connected, they're connected precisely because of the fact that we face these common challenges, and they affect our prosperities and our stability of our communities and even the region. And in that sense, I would say that we are actually in the very early phase of this kind of cooperation, where we need to actually, as has been mentioned earlier, develop these special forums of track 1, track 2, and others, where we actually can flesh out, learn from each other's experience, flesh out actual policy measures, which can then be adopted by the countries. Here, of course, and then as I said, that the entire spectrum of institutional resources required is quite vast. Now, here again, we find that although initial experience has been positive in certain respects, but at least going by the experience of India, I would say that the private sector is not as yet fully engaged in tapping the resource of the blue economy, perhaps because of hesitation, because they're not sure about the regulations, the standards, the norms, and various kinds of frameworks, standardization, and so on and so forth, that they are not yet fully engaged in that, and therefore the task of this kind of collaboration that we are developing is actually to provide that kind of infrastructure for this kind of cooperation. And of course, where there has been good collaboration, the results have been quite good and encouraging. And in fact, there have been instances of coastal management zones where the return on investment is something like about 5 times 5 times this. So therefore, there is a tremendous scope for developing, sharing of experience, working out our various policy interface where we need to sort out these glitches and crease out our in terms of our policy regulations, whether standardization, the common norms, the common normative framework, and all that, as I said, requires entire spectrum. We're talking about rural communities to the high end of our cooperation. The India-ASEAN Summit 2018 was, I think, a good beginning, but actually we have to remind ourselves, actually it's the beginning. It just gives us the basic steer, the basic direction in which this cooperation should develop, and we still have a long way to go. One more thing I would want to say here is that when we talk in terms of maritime connectivity, I think we should be a little careful in terms of the economic viabilities of various projects that we are looking at. As has been pointed out by Professor Dave, that in a way there is a bit of a tapering off of global trade, and therefore at this time to invest too much money, as it is, there are there is a feeling that we might perhaps be over-investing in terms of port capacity and in terms of the infrastructure we're talking about. And we should not, quite frankly, we already have some examples, no need to name countries, but we have examples where some of the projects actually have become unsustainable, leading to debt trap, and thereby, by itself, they impose a constraint on the development of that kind of cooperation. So I'd actually say that we have to be judicious in terms of going in for projects, in terms of the economic viability of these projects, because once we do that, then we are able to develop at a steady pace and thereby create a virtuous cycle which can then pick up speed as we go along. Now, it's already been mentioned, I will not take much more time, that already the policy framework needs to be set in place through this cooperation between our nodal agencies, between India and ASEAN, and also amongst the ASEAN member countries. We also have other sub-regional organizations. The BIMSTEC has been mentioned already. Mekong Ganga Cooperation Organization is another one, and that's again an area where we can bring together or tap the resources that are being developed by these sub-regional organizations. Maritime transport agreement, hopefully it will be signed soon enough so that it provides that kind of a framework. India-ASEAN FTA in goods is already in place, but you can imagine that unless the India-ASEAN FTA in services investment, unless that comes into effect, obviously the development, the growth of this particular sector, the blue economy, and the fact that we talk in terms of ecological sustainability of the use of ocean resources and for connecting communities across the littoral in the entire zone, geographical space, I think that would not really develop as it ought to develop in terms of the objectives that we have in mind. So I would actually basically say that just to basically conclude, that the scope of activities by government agencies, as far as I can see, ranges from the national to local level, to non-government agencies, business, scientific community, civil society, media, and people-to-people contacts. And managing blue economy complex requires sophistication of governance, micro-coordination with local communities, and sustainable business models. It is a test for global and regional cooperation and sublimation of national narrow interests. The basic roadmap has been established with supporting institutional mechanisms, but we have a long road ahead. And if we are to realize the vision and the destiny of our cooperation, then I would say that we are situated at the time when there is an opportunity for us, and there is an imperative necessity with the requirement for judicious management of the geostrategic environment for a virtuous dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for very comprehensive views on the coordination, on the connectivity between ocean and also hinterland, and also global efforts. Yeah. And now we have some time to discuss, and I believe that we can have some fruitful discussions. But I would like to invite maybe for first round 3 questions or comments from the floor. And please briefly introduce your name and your affiliations before posting your comments or your questions.